Science fiction is a wonderful thing. It's given us some of the most unique and interesting stories wrapped up in some of the most beautiful and original worlds. The term sci-fi goes all the way back to the 50s, and it stands for so much more than space technology and aliens. It's about the human reaction to changes beyond what we've experienced in the past, be it technology or a third party. It also speaks to the changes in humans and their lives with a higher influence of technology present. Immersing ourselves in these worlds and stories is all about the experience. There's a sense of nostalgia to things we've never seen and a comfort in moments we've never experienced. Having previously looked at Another World, I wasn't planning on talking about a similar game anytime soon, and definitely not one from the same developer. But when I saw this one pop up on the store, there was just no stopping it. With barely a year between Another World and Flashback, and this being the early 90s, you wouldn't expect them to be as vastly different as they are. The two games share gorgeous vector graphics that breathe a life into the movements of characters that hardly any other game has been able to do as well, even until today. Flashback is more than just a younger brother though. It's a unique entry into the cinematic platformer family and is a big nod to multiple science fiction movies and stories, with tons of references. Legendary writer and designer Paul Cuisset, who had previously made the brilliant Future Wars, clearly put some great effort into creating a game that not only captures that true sense of wonder that good science fiction does, but also wraps itself around a generally well-directed experience. Originally released in 1992 on the Amiga, the game soon found its way onto multiple other platforms, and in doing so gained the love of hundreds of thousands of players by 1995. Near 750,000 to be more specific. To say that Flashback forms a core part of gaming history and an important part of many of our lives as gamers is a serious understatement. It changed the quality we expected from platformers and games in general, both artistically and in narrative. Flashback has a single protagonist and a number of other characters that for the most part blend in with the background. We come into contact with other humans as well as morphs, an alien race who can disguise themselves as human, whose true form can only be seen through special glasses. The only real exception in terms of characters are a couple of key people that form a core part of our adventure. We follow the adventure of Conrad B. Hart, a man with no memory of who he is. We soon meet up with Ian, an old friend who helps restore Conrad's memory through the use of a machine called a regenerator. Here we are told through a short cinematic sequence small bits of his history and how Conrad came to be where he is now. Most character interaction within the game is limited and little development exists between them, but for the most part, and much like a lot of sci-fi from the time, the story is primarily built around the single protagonist fighting against all odds, and that's exactly what we would expect. Similar to Another World before it, Flashback is drawn with simplistic yet absolutely fluid vector graphics, but just with a little more flesh. The character movements in Flashback are unrivaled, dare I say even to this day. It's not cartoony or overstated, and the modest animation is as realistic as you could ever expect to see in a pixelated 2D game. It's smooth and natural, adding to the cinematic sense of the experience. But of course, these kinds of animations are bound to certain limitations which allow it such fluid motions. The art style in games such as Flashback relies on very strict rules. Movements are set sprites and frames that need to complete before another action can begin, instead of being reactive to every press of a button. Now this kind of animation, though seemingly limited at first, has vast artistic potential and aids in creating a more rounded experience. The character doesn't flip from facing left to facing right, but rather turns with a full animation, a small but meaningful detail. The advantage here is that we are given gameplay that is relatively easy to get accustomed to and quick to understand the limitations and flow of the character's movement. Though it might sound a bit restricting in the way that it's bound to movements within certain blocks and distances, it sacrifices this complete freedom for uncompromising lifelike motions, giving the game a more natural visual that adds to its movie-like immersion. Dialogue in Flashback is limited, but different to Another World, it relies less on visual storytelling and instead tells full-length stories with simplistic but complete cutscenes. The introduction alone is an absolute feast for the senses. Like any good sci-fi, it drops you right into the action, creating an instant engagement in the story. Similar to books, we aren't always interested in safe and mundane beginnings, and with an introduction as adrenaline-fueled as this, the writers create an interest in the narrative from the first moment. The point of this kind of storytelling isn't about clean action simply to entice and excite us, as so many shallow movies often do. It's about attracting curiosity and raising questions like why or where. We are drawn in, wondering what happened before this moment and what follows it. Just to be clear here, there's absolutely nothing wrong with slower routine beginnings either, as the most important thing in an introduction is to create engagement. But in the context of Flashback, it fills that function perfectly with an action-heavy start. Now, of course, the sublimely realistic looking animation does help. It seems almost as though you are looking at live action footage that has been put through a filter to look pixelated, because that's just how believable the movements often are. Flashback doesn't make use of complementary or contradicting colors, but instead builds something foreign with a natural feel to it. There's a neon sci-fi Blade Runner-esque look to certain areas that even the flat tones of the 90s somehow managed. Even the environments are organic and we don't feel like we are just scaling a set of platforms. That said, the objects in Flashback do sometimes feel a bit more immovable and railed than they did in Another World, giving it a more traditional platformer experience. However, this shouldn't be misunderstood as meaning that there is no depth to it, as Flashback combines its art and gameplay to present a more graphic novel-like experience. The world of Flashback is a throwback to so many great films and stories that came before it. There's a bit of Total Recall in the mechanics, a shout to Blade Runner when it comes to questioning humanity, and similarly also a hint at They Live. The world even nods at the original Valerian at Laureline, with the design style of its different settings and locations. And of course there's also a touch of Running Man. Now, all these fine influences have given Flashback immortality in the way that it speaks to an undying audience through a theme that is ever-changing yet never strays too far from its roots. I wouldn't call it pure cyberpunk, but there are comparable likenesses there too. The music direction is reliably 80s and keeps a firm hand on consistency, giving the experience a flow that doesn't disrupt with vastly different themes or sounds. The game even adds to the immersion with music that changes based on the player's experience, which might not seem like much now, but at the time was a relatively young concept to give a game a more cinematic and tense atmosphere. The sound design is minimalist not to distract, giving key events the opportunity to have a much bigger impact on the experience. Of course, the remastered version does allow you to change a few graphical settings like simulated CRT, noise and static, and all kinds of other things to make it near impossible to see what the hell is actually going on. Now, all these little improvements, though thoughtful, isn't necessary, as Flashback doesn't need to be any more than it was in 1992, because all that it is and was works. The gameplay of Flashback is unforgiving, limiting and tough. You'll die in gunfights, from bad jumps or just from your own impatience. Now, it's not the easiest game to get used to and at times can be frustrating to some. The static screens often has you popping in and out of situations to best prepare for what's ahead. But none of these detract from the core experience and quite honestly forms a key part of it. Like I've previously mentioned, the movements in the game are bound to certain rules thanks to the type of animation in favor of a more cinematic experience. There's a proper learning curve to the controls, but once you do get the hang of it, it quickly becomes second nature. Distances between jumps become more predictable, and it's easy to know the limitations of the protagonist in terms of movements and ability. The character often needs to be positioned just right to be able to clear jumps or reach platforms, but once you're used to it, which might require 1 or 2 tries, it does become a bit simpler to traverse the world. With save points quite far apart, you'll often find yourself repeating large sections of the game over and over whenever you fail. This kind of gameplay is definitely not for everyone, especially with the path of most games today being spoon-fed. But the charm of the experience keeps you going as the attention to detail is elevating and the story keeps unfolding with the flip of every static screen. During gameplay, we also find objects around the world that you can use to open doors, access areas, and so on. And even these small events have little cinematic screens, every single one. But it's still damn charming, isn't it? Conrad can roll, jump, activate force fields, and shoot the odd enemy, giving us just a few more options in terms of engagement that feels flexible even when most of the experience is scripted. We are not expecting a game of pure freedom though, we are here to play through a science fiction experience. And even if we weren't in control of the protagonist at all, it still would have been great fun just to watch the story progress. It's not always fast paced, but it does have a bigger sense of rush and urgency than similar cinematic platformers. For all that it presents us, the greatest thing that Flashback is an experience filled with character. The year is 2140 and we are instantly thrown into the action, and out of the frying pan into the fire. We find ourselves stranded in a jungle on the planet Titan and receive a message to meet with a man called Ian in New Washington. Needing to get back to Earth, the only way to afford a ticket is to partake in a deadly game show. We spend our time doing jobs within and between cities to gather enough money to get false papers to enter the show, and find ourselves in many dangerous situations along the way. From prisoner to escapee to savior, we take Conrad through Earth and to the planet of the Morphs, where we are to destroy the master brain that controls the aliens. The game ends in a beautifully classic and open conclusion that also allows for the beginning of Flashback's sequel, Fade to Black. The world, the narrative and design of Flashback all combine to shape a gorgeously classic science fiction experience that not only tips its hat at those who inspired it, but also builds upon what it's learned from them. Even after all these years, Flashback still maintains that sense of reality and credibility in itself and the story it has to tell through solid gameplay, superbly natural animation and a compelling plot. Great games like these just don't age. Now if you liked what I had to say, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos about games as works of art.